My dad snapped at Thanksgiving. Without us, you'd be nothing. I just smiled. He demanded, "What's so funny?" I replied, "Because, Dad, the company that just bought your house is owned by me." I, 32M, sat in my car outside my parents' house that Thanksgiving afternoon, watching the golden light filter through the oak trees I used to climb as a kid. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. 20 minutes early, but I couldn't bring myself to go in yet. The colonial-style house looked the same as it always had, imposing and perfect, the kind of home that screamed success to the neighbors. I knew better. I knew what lived behind that pristine white facade. My phone buzzed. A text from my attorney confirming everything was finalized. The timing was perfect, almost poetic. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Mom answered the door with her practiced smile, the one she'd perfected over decades of hosting charity events and country club dinners. She pulled me into a hug that felt more like a performance than genuine affection. She told me how wonderful it was to see me, how long it had been, her voice carrying that subtle note of accusation she'd mastered. 6 months since my last visit. Not that anyone was counting. Well, she was counting. Dad barely looked up from his leather recliner when I entered the living room. He grunted something that might have been a greeting, his eyes fixed on the football game. His hair had gotten grayer since I'd last seen him, his face more lined, but the cold authority in his posture remained unchanged. My younger sister was in the kitchen helping Mom, and she gave me a genuine smile when I walked in. She was the only one who'd stayed in touch consistently, the only one who seemed to care about me as a person rather than as a disappointment. The house smelled like roasted turkey and the expensive candles Mom ordered from some boutique in Manhattan. Everything was immaculate, everything in its place. Growing up here had felt like living in a museum where I was the exhibit that never quite measured up to expectations. Dinner started pleasantly enough, if you considered strained small talk pleasant. Mom asked about my work in that dismissive tone she used whenever my career came up, as if my software company was just a phase I'd eventually grow out of. I kept my answers vague, professional. My sister asked more genuine questions about my life in Seattle, and I appreciated her effort to keep things civil. Then Dad started drinking more heavily than usual. I watched his wine glass empty and refill with increasing frequency, watched his face get redder, his comments sharper. He began talking about their upcoming vacation to Europe, some river cruise they'd booked through their financial advisor. He mentioned offhandedly how their investments had been performing, how their retirement portfolio was stronger than ever. The subtext was clear, as always. They'd succeeded where I'd inevitably fail. Mom joined in, discussing their recent kitchen renovation, the new luxury SUV Dad had bought, the country club membership they'd renewed. Every sentence was a carefully placed reminder of their wealth, their status, their success. My sister shot me apologetic looks across the table, but she knew better than to interrupt when our parents were on a roll. I ate my turkey and smiled and nodded in all the right places. Then Dad leaned back in his chair, that smug expression I knew so well settling across his features. He started talking about my childhood, how they'd given me every advantage, the best schools, the best opportunities. How they'd paid for my college education at a prestigious university. How they'd supported me even when I'd made questionable decisions, like moving across the country to start some tech company instead of joining Dad's law firm like he'd planned. Mom chimed in with her own version of events, reminding everyone how worried they'd been when I dropped out of law school after just 1 year. How humiliating it had been to explain to their friends that their son had thrown away a guaranteed partnership to chase some Silicon Valley pipe dream. My sister tried to change the subject, mentioning something about dessert, but Dad wasn't finished. He looked directly at me for the first time all evening, his eyes sharp despite the alcohol. He said I needed to understand something, needed to face reality. He told me that without them, without their money, their connections, their support, I'd be nothing. He said I'd never amount to anything on my own, that my little computer business was just playing around with their safety net beneath me. Mom nodded along, adding that it was time I grew up, accepted a real position with Dad's firm, stopped wasting my potential on childish pursuits. She said they hadn't raised me to be mediocre, to settle for some startup that would inevitably fail like 90% of them did. The room fell silent except for the sound of silverware scraping against fine china. My sister looked mortified, her face flushed. She started to say something defensive on my behalf, but I held up my hand gently. I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not an angry smile. A genuine, amused smile that seemed to confuse everyone at the table. Mom demanded to know what was so funny, her voice sharp with indignation. Dad's face darkened, clearly interpreting my smile as disrespect. He asked if I thought this was a joke, if I was mocking them after everything they'd done for me. I took a sip of water, letting the moment stretch. Then I told them there was something they should probably know. Something I'd been meaning to mention. Dad's eyebrows raised, his expression already dismissive, probably expecting some small accomplishment he could minimize. Mom crossed her arms, waiting. I explained that my company, the one they'd always dismissed as a hobby, had been acquired by a larger tech firm 18 months ago. I'd stayed on as CTO, but had cashed out a significant portion of my equity. The acquisition had valued my company at just over $200 million. My personal take, after taxes and investor payouts, had been substantial enough to make some interesting investments. The table had gone completely still. Dad's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth. I continued, keeping my voice calm and pleasant. I mentioned that I'd diversified into real estate through a holding company, purchasing several properties across the country. Commercial buildings mostly, some residential. The kind of investments that generated passive income while appreciating in value. Mom's face had gone pale. She'd stopped eating entirely. I let the silence build for just a moment longer before I delivered the final piece of information. I told them that the foreclosure notice they'd received 3 weeks ago, the one for this house, had been purchased by one of my subsidiary companies. The company that now owned the debt on their home, the company that had just completed the legal acquisition of the property due to their default on the second mortgage they'd taken out to fund their lifestyle, that company was mine. Dad's face went from red to purple to an ashy gray in the span of seconds. He started to speak, stopped, started again. He demanded to know what I was talking about, his voice hoarse. He said there must be some mistake, some confusion. I pulled out my phone and showed them the documentation my attorney had sent. The LLC name, the property address, the transfer of deed. Everything legal, everything final. I'd purchased the debt from their original lender at a discount 3 months ago, when they'd first started missing payments. I'd watched as they'd ignored the warnings, the notices, too proud to mention their financial troubles to anyone, especially to me. Mom's hand trembled as she set down her wine glass. She asked why I hadn't said anything, why I'd let this happen. The irony of her question wasn't lost on anyone. I explained that I'd actually reached out twice through my attorney, offering to restructure the debt, to work out a payment plan. Both times, they'd refused to engage, assuming it was just another scam, another nuisance. They hadn't recognized the company name because I'd specifically structured it to be discreet. They'd been too proud to ask for help, too proud to admit they were in trouble. Dad found his voice again, demanding to know what I intended to do. His authoritative tone had cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. He said I couldn't possibly throw my own parents out on the street, that I had to fix this, to make it right. I took another sip of water, taking my time. I told them I'd already made my decision. They had 60 days to vacate the property, standard procedure. However, I was willing to offer them an alternative arrangement. Mom leaned forward, hope flickering across her face. She asked what kind of arrangement, her voice barely above a whisper. I laid out the terms clearly. They could remain in the house as tenants, paying market rate rent. The amount was substantial but manageable if they adjusted their lifestyle significantly. No more European vacations, no more luxury vehicles, no more country club memberships. They'd need to liquidate their non-essential assets, downsize their spending, live within actual means rather than borrowed ones. Additionally, I required a formal, written apology for 32 years of belittlement, dismissal, and emotional manipulation. Not for me specifically, though that would be nice. For my sister, who'd watched them treat her brother like a failure. For themselves, acknowledging how their obsession with appearances and status had driven them to financial ruin. Dad exploded, his fists slamming on the table hard enough to rattle the dishes. He said I was being ridiculous, vindictive, cruel. He called me ungrateful, said I was spitting on everything they'd sacrificed for me. He demanded I tear up the paperwork, sign the house back over to them, forget this whole thing. I remained calm, my voice steady. I reminded him that this was his house I was sitting in, that these were his choices that had led to this moment. Every luxury purchase they'd made while carrying massive debt, every vacation they'd taken while missing mortgage payments, every dismissive comment about my career while they spiraled toward bankruptcy. I told him I hadn't created this situation. I'd simply positioned myself to control the outcome. Mom started crying, but they weren't sad tears. They were angry, frustrated tears of someone who'd been outmaneuvered and knew it. She said I was being hateful. That family doesn't treat family this way. She accused me of plotting revenge, of deliberately hurting them when they were vulnerable. I turned to her and asked if she remembered my graduation from college. She looked confused by the question, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. I reminded her of the speech Dad had given at the family dinner that night, how he'd spent 20 minutes explaining to relatives why my computer science degree was a waste of potential, how I was settling for mediocrity instead of pursuing law like a serious person. I asked if she remembered when I called them 3 years ago, excited about my company's Series B funding round, how Dad had cut me off mid-sentence to complain about his golf game. I asked if she remembered the Christmas I'd brought my girlfriend to meet them, how they'd spent the entire visit making comments about her background, her education, her family's lack of social standing. She'd broken up with me 2 weeks later, unable to handle the contempt they'd shown her. My sister had tears streaming down her face now, but she was nodding. She remembered all of it. She'd been there for every casual cruelty, every dismissive comment, every reminder that I was a disappointment. I stood up from the table, my own plate barely touched. I told them they had until end of business tomorrow to provide their written response to my offer. If they accepted the terms, we'd draw up a lease agreement. If they refused, the eviction proceedings would continue as scheduled. Their choice entirely. Dad tried one more time, his voice breaking slightly. He said he was my father, that I owed him respect, that this was unconscionable. He asked how I could do this to the people who'd raised me, who'd loved me. I paused at the doorway to the dining room, looking back at them. I told him that love wasn't what I'd experienced growing up in this house. Control, yes. Manipulation, absolutely. Conditional approval based on meeting their expectations, constantly. But love, real love, the kind that supports and encourages and celebrates who someone actually is rather than who you want them to be, that I'd had to find elsewhere. I thanked my sister for trying to keep the peace, told her I'd call her later. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I knew this was hard for her, caught in the middle, but she'd also lived under their roof long enough to understand where this came from. I walked out of that house for what might be the last time as a guest. The evening air was cold against my face, clearing my head. My hands were shaking slightly as I got into my car, the adrenaline finally catching up with me. I sat there for a moment, looking at the house again, seeing it differently now. It wasn't the imposing monument to success anymore. It was just a building, mortar and wood and broken dreams. My phone rang before I'd even pulled out of the driveway. My sister, her voice thick with emotion. She said she didn't know whether to be horrified or proud, whether what I'd done was justice or revenge. She asked if I really planned to follow through with the eviction if they refused my terms. I told her honestly that I didn't know. Part of me hoped they'd accept the offer, that this could be a wake-up call, a chance to rebuild something real between us. Part of me expected them to refuse, too proud to admit fault, too stubborn to bend even when breaking. Either way, the outcome was in their hands now. I'd given them a choice, which was more than they'd ever given me. She was quiet for a moment, then told me she loved me. She said she understood why I'd done this, even if she wished there'd been another way. She promised to keep me updated on what happened next. Update 1. I got the response 2 days later, on Saturday morning. My attorney forwarded me the email from their lawyer, a colleague of Dad's from his firm. The tone was formal, cold, threatening legal action for emotional distress, elder abuse, coercion. All bluster, no substance. They'd consulted with 3 different attorneys apparently, all of whom had told them the same thing. Everything I'd done was completely legal. The debt was mine, the foreclosure was legitimate, and my offer to allow them to stay as tenants was actually generous compared to my legal alternatives. But they wouldn't accept my terms. Specifically, they refused to provide a written apology. Dad's lawyer made it clear that my father considered such a demand to be extortionate and demeaning, beneath his dignity as a respected attorney and father. They were, however, willing to discuss a lease agreement without the apology requirement. I declined. The terms weren't negotiable, and I'd made that clear from the beginning. The apology was the only thing I actually wanted. Without it, They were just tenants who happened to be related to me, and I had no interest in being their landlord under those circumstances. My sister called me crying that night. She said Dad had been raging for hours, throwing things, screaming about ungrateful children and conspiracy. Mom had locked herself in the bedroom and refused to come out. The house felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. She asked if there was any way I'd reconsider, any compromise I'd accept. I asked her a question in return. Did she think they were actually sorry? Did she believe they'd genuinely realized how their treatment of me had been wrong? Or were they just desperate to keep their house? She went quiet. Then, her voice small, she admitted she didn't think they were sorry at all. She said Dad kept ranting about how I'd blindsided them, ambushed them, used my money as a weapon. Not once had he acknowledged his own role in creating the distance between us. Not once had he considered that maybe, just maybe, his son had valid reasons for doing what he'd done. I told her I loved her and ended the call. The eviction notice was served the following Monday. I wasn't there for it, but my sister described the scene. Dad tried to refuse the paperwork, actually tore it up in front of the process server. Mom stood behind him, her face blank in shock. The server calmly informed them that destroying the notice didn't invalidate it, and left a second copy on their doorstep. Update 2. Thanksgiving became Christmas, and the deadline approached. I heard through my sister that they'd started packing, moving items into storage. They'd listed their luxury SUV for sale, along with most of Mom's jewelry and Dad's golf club membership. Reality was setting in, the life they'd built on credit and appearances crumbling around them. My sister asked if she could give them my personal number, if I'd be willing to talk to them directly. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Dad called on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the final eviction date. His voice sounded older somehow, tired. He didn't yell or rage this time. He asked if we could meet somewhere neutral, just the two of us, to talk things through man to man. I met him at a coffee shop downtown, far from their neighborhood, somewhere we wouldn't run into anyone they knew. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, the exhaustion in his eyes. He started by telling me he still thought what I'd done was wrong, vindictive. But he admitted, haltingly, that maybe he hadn't been the father I'd needed. Maybe he'd pushed too hard, expected too much, failed to see me for who I actually was rather than who he'd wanted me to be. The words came slowly, painfully, like pulling teeth. This wasn't an apology, not really. It was an acknowledgement, the bare minimum of self-awareness. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him what he wanted from this conversation, what outcome he was hoping for. He said he wanted his son back. He wanted a chance to rebuild, to start over, to have a relationship that wasn't defined by this moment. He admitted, finally, that he was scared. Scared of losing everything. Yes, but also scared of losing me permanently. He said he'd been a stubborn old fool, and maybe it was time to stop being so goddamn proud. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was something. I told him I'd extend the deadline by 30 days. In that time, I wanted him to attend family therapy sessions with me, mediated by a professional. I wanted Mom there too. I wanted to have real conversations about our family, our history, the patterns that had brought us to this point. And yes, eventually, I still wanted that apology. But I wanted it to be genuine, not coerced. I wanted them to actually understand what they were apologizing for. He agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. He thanked me, and for the first time in my memory, he looked at me like I was someone worthy of respect rather than disappointment. The therapy sessions were brutal. Mom cried through most of the first 3. Dad got angry in session 4, stormed out, came back the next week sheepish and determined to try again. We unpacked decades of dysfunction, of conditional love, of expectations that had crushed rather than motivated. My sister joined us for several sessions, adding her own experiences, her own pain that I hadn't fully understood. Slowly, painfully, something began to shift. The written apology came in the mail 6 weeks after our coffee shop meeting, handwritten on actual paper. 3 pages from Dad, 2 from Mom. It wasn't perfect. There were still traces of defensiveness, of justification, but it was real. They acknowledged specific moments, specific hurts. They took responsibility for the environment they'd created, the damage they'd caused. They said they wanted to be better, to do better, if I'd give them the chance. I sat in my Seattle apartment reading those letters, and for the first time in months, I felt something release in my chest. This was what I'd actually wanted all along. Not revenge, Not even justice, really. Just acknowledgement. Just the simple recognition that I'd been hurt, and that hurt mattered. I called my attorney the next morning and had him draw up a lease agreement. Below market rate, terms favorable to them, with an option to purchase the house back over time if they could demonstrate financial stability. I wasn't trying to profit off my parents' misfortune. I just needed them to see me, really see me, as something other than their disappointing investment. Update 3. It's been 8 months now since that Thanksgiving dinner. My parents are still in the house, paying rent on time every month. Dad took a position at a smaller firm, less prestigious but steadier. Mom went back to work part-time at a nonprofit, something she actually seems to enjoy. They drive modest cars and take modest vacations, and from what my sister tells me, they seem less stressed despite having less money. We have dinner once a month now, alternating between their place and restaurants. The conversations are still sometimes awkward, still sometimes tense, but there's an honesty there that never existed before. Dad asks about my work with genuine interest. Mom talks about her own life rather than just performing success for an invisible audience. Last month, Dad told me he was proud of me. Not for my money, not for my success, but for standing up for myself. For refusing to accept the role they'd assigned me. He said he wished he'd been brave enough to do the same with his own father. I'm not sure we'll ever have the relationship I wish we'd had from the beginning. Too much history, too many scars. But we're building something new, something real, and that's more than I had before. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes it's about forcing people to see what they've refused to acknowledge, creating a crisis that makes growth possible. I backed my parents into a corner not to hurt them, but because it was the only way to break through decades of willful blindness. Was it right? I still don't know. Was it necessary? For me, yes. For them, maybe. The house is just a house now. Not a symbol of their success or my failure or family dysfunction. Just a place where people live, where we're slowly learning how to be a family that might actually deserve the name. And honestly, that's worth more than any revenge could ever be.